Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the National Wireless Safety Alliance's webinar, Exam Outline and Knowledge Domain 101. My name is Matthew Shaw. I work closely with the National Wireless Safety Alliance, and I'm going to be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is part of NWSA's continuing webinar series and will provide a detailed walkthrough of the NWSA Telecommunications Tower Technician, or TTT 1, written exam outline and the knowledge domains. Whether you are a technician or a training provider or a company representative, supervisor, this webinar is going to provide insight into the NWSA process and how best to prepare for the written exam. If you have any questions regarding the information presented during today's webinar, please feel free to contact NWSA. We'll have that contact info up on a slide towards the end of today's presentation. We'll also have a question and answer session as time allows at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions during the webinar via the question chat box in your console. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Chris Mallon. Chris is the chairman of the NWSA TTT Written Exam Management Committee. Chris also serves on the Telecommunications Tower Technician Task Force, which played a key role in developing the TTT 1 and 2 certification programs. Chris is also a member of the NWSA Board of Governors and serves on the NWSA Tower Foreman Task Force. Chris is the president of Tower MRL and is based in Wisconsin. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris to continue the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Appreciate the introduction there. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to listen to me babble today about a topic that we've spent a lot of time developing over the last several years here. So today we're going to talk about some topics related to this program and mainly focus on the Telecommunication Tower Technician 1 written exam. We'll mention a few things about the other exams and some of the practical exam situations. So we'll give a brief introduction about the program. We'll talk a little bit about the candidate handbook, and then we'll really dive into the knowledge domains areas. What are the domains? We'll talk about some of the information related to the test outline, the reference lists, also the examinations themselves, both the written and the practical. So that's basically your general outline. So next one, Matt, we'll get into it. So just to give you a brief overview, right now, for those of you that don't know, NWSA has two credentials out there that we're certifying technicians with right now. They're the Telecommunication Tower Technician 1, or the TTT 1 as it's called, and the Telecommunication Tower Technician number 2, the TTT number 2. So there's two different credentials out there, and really the basic difference, or what I want to emphasize today, is that really the TTT 1 is a person that is doing the work and being told to do the work. The TTT 2 is somebody that can do the work, but is also somebody that is supervising either TTT 1s or trainees and things like that. So those are kind of your generic differences between the two. To get these credentials, there's two things you must accomplish. There's a written computer-based test and a practical exam that you need to complete. So that you don't need to do them in any particular order, but you must complete the computer-based testing and the practical exam to receive a credential. Once you receive those credentials, they are valid for a 5-year period. Next, Matt. Next one there, Matt. So the program was developed over a pretty lengthy period. They were developed by subject matter experts over about an 18-month period a few years back. I was involved in a lot of the process for that original task force, focused a lot on developing of the written exam. There was a real need to develop a baseline set of knowledge for the industry, and that's what came out of this. So the other need that was out there was to be able to demonstrate it. So the written exams and the practical exams are out there to basically demonstrate your mental knowledge. Do you know what you're doing? And then also the need for a skills assessment. Can you physically do this stuff? And that's basically what the two differences in the exams are. If it's a mental type testing situation, we try to test it based in a written exam. But if it's something where only you can demonstrate a skill, then we try to put it into the practical exams. So you really need to have at this particular level, two different types of tests. So the next thing is just to re-emphasize that NWSA is really a credentialing program. We provide some information about these tests to you guys, but we're really not here to train you on how to take these tests or provide training materials for you. Next one, Matt. So you can find this information on the NWSA website. So I recommend, if you guys haven't taken any of these tests at this point or know a whole lot of information about it, you want to start with the website. You go to the handbook and forms section there, and you can find what you need. So the handbook, which is the next slide there, Matt. The handbook is really your starting point. The handbook has a lot of information in it related to what you guys need to find. It lists things like the domains for instance, the references. There are some sample questions. The application process is in there. The topics for the practical exams. There is a breakdown of what all the exam is for completion on the practical exams for both the 1 and the 2. So that's where I recommend that you start looking at it. You start looking at the domains. You start looking at the practical exam information. You look at the questions that are listed there. So let's move on to the outline in the CBT testing. So this is really the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to get to today. We want to talk about the domains that are out there. This written test is done at the PSI facilities around the country, so you do need to sign up for them. You do need to go to these locations. They're computer-based tests, so they're not a written exam. You have to be able to operate a computer to get through these tests. So as you can see, the TTT1 has 6 domains. They're listed here. You can also see that the percentage of how much each domain impacts the test. These percentages are listed in the handbook, so you don't necessarily need to write them down. But what I want to mention as it relates to these domains just generically is you look at domain number 2, climbing. That's a large percentage of the test. But what I want you to also understand about this particular domain is it really is defined as fall protection and not so much the actual act of climbing. This domain does come into play more on the practical exam from a percentage standpoint in the actual act of climbing. But as far as the written exam goes, we're really a better explanation for this domain is really fall protection and the things associated with the use of fall protection or the types of fall protection. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at these things, what they may really be. So let's dive into it a little further and move on to the job logistics, and let's break that down. So we're going to try to get into these things a little more specific, and what I wanted to talk about was how I trained people within my company and things that I looked at for studying for this written exam. Obviously, I have a little more insight into the exam than some people when it comes to training, but I think it's really a pretty basic situation. When you look at training your guys, it really falls into some pretty basic categories. You're looking at an OSHA 10-hour class, a competent climbing class, an RF class, a rigging, and then a remainder of a lot of this stuff really falls to on-the-job training. So there's not necessarily a standard or a way to study for this. It really needs to be developed within the program of your company. So when you look at job logistics in particular, we're talking about things like hazards, daily meetings, basic RF radiation, appropriate PPE. When I think of these kinds of things and how I looked at training my guys, these are all OSHA 10-hour type situations. When you look at your OSHA 10-hour classes that guys are participating in, you can take those classes and really strip them down to the nuts and bolts of what's really being talked about in those classes. We don't really need to know about the history of OSHA and how it was developed and things like that, but we can really get into hazard analysis, JHA type situations, basic RF, PPE selection. Those are standard OSHA criteria. And when it comes to training your guys, a lot of that information is really in the OSHA 10-hour class. So if you really take your OSHA 10-hour class, you can break that down into probably 3 or 4 hours and utilize that as part of your training for guys. Or if you have it as a PowerPoint presentation or something like that, there's a lot of information in that document that will help you to better understand the questions or be able to answer the questions on the exam as it relates to this particular category. So the next category is climbing. Matt, if you want to give us the next one there. So as I mentioned, I look at this as really more fall protection. If you look at the things that are listed here, we're talking about the use of fall protection, performing a rescue, climbing facilities, anchorages, attachment points, portable ladders, controlled descent. So these are all things that generally are showing up in your fall protection training. If you're doing any types of competent climber classes, a Gravitech, for example, or VRS, or some sort of internal competent climber type training program, these types of things should be discussed during that training program. But these all fall back to that Z359 standard. So a lot of the information in this section really falls back to the Z359 standard. There's a few things that fall back to the 1048 standard. And so right now, in these first two categories, we're looking at almost 20 or almost 50% of the exam, I believe here. And we're really looking at only a couple of standards, OSHA and the Z359. So you need to look at some of this stuff and you need to help the guys understand, like, for example, the term climbing facilities. Climbing facilities is something that the engineering and the standards people have come up with. Anchorage attachment points, that's some language that the guys may not understand. So you need to work as a trainer or safety person or company owner, focus on some of this language, become familiar with the standards, understand what a climbing facility is and some of these terms, so that when you're talking to your employees, you can help them understand it when they're looking at the standards. So the next section is hoisting and equipment rigging. Like anything, there's some standard here, and this is a pretty main focus of our test. But so when you're looking at this section, you're talking about hoisting, you're talking about rigging, you're talking about the effects of rigging on the tower, ropes and knots, and gin poles. Now understand that we're talking about a triple T1 person here. So their knowledge level of these particular items listed here is pretty basic. You're not having a triple T1 employee running a base mounted hoist necessarily, or inspecting hoists, or inspecting personal lifting equipment or platforms, things of that nature. Well, what we're focused on here is a general awareness of some of this stuff. What are some of these things? Can they recognize some of this stuff? Can they tie a knot? Can they recognize a knot is tied correctly? Do they know what a gin pole is? Things of that is what we're after. Now, all of these items predominantly fall under the A1048 standard. And I would recommend, for the $150 that people are charging for this standard, based on my involvement and some other things that are going on in the industry right now, the A1048 standard is ultimately going to likely be the Bible of how the tower industry does things. And so this is going to become a really important standard to people that are involved in the industry on how we do things and some of the safety regulations associated. So this is a standard that is easily obtained and is something that I feel is going to be very important in having on hand and making your people familiar with. So this type of rigging type stuff is a lot of that is in A1048. The other one that you want to consider here for at least a few of the sections is the B30 standard. There are some specific sections in there related to rigging equipment and slings and things of that nature. That becomes more of an issue on your Triple T2 exam, but there are some generic type questions related to rigging and hoisting. So keep that in mind as it relates to this particular section, to really focus on the A1048 when you're talking about training people related to these questions. So the next section is structures. And this one is a little harder from a training point of view because you're talking about some job hazard assessments, identifying structure types, routine maintenance, construction drawings, grounding, things of that nature. And we're trying to make these, entry-level people aware of some of the things that are out there and the dangers that they need to be concerned about. There's two standards that really apply to these things, and that's the TIA 222 standard and the ANSI 322 standard. But a lot of what's in those standards is engineering related. It's kind of higher level stuff and not necessarily so much for your basic entry level guy. So a lot of this stuff here is really falls back to the company's training program and what I'm calling on the job training. Can your person identify a tower structure type? Can they identify, what's coax on a tower versus a piece of fiber on a tower? Can they identify a panel antenna versus a microwave antenna or a broadcast antenna or a dipole antenna, things of those nature? And those are things that aren't really taught from a standard. They're really taught from working in the field, having your crew members, explaining things to guys that are new, having some training programs within your company where you're talking about what structure types are out there. When you're talking about jobs that you're going to, talking about the structure type and the things that may be important to know about that structure. What things are different between structures, what things are different between coax, antennas, what might be the frequencies of some of this stuff. But we're looking at all of this on a pretty basic level. We're not getting in real in depth in this kind of stuff. So, but when you're looking at a program, this portion of the test, you're going to have to look at putting something to basically together yourself to address these types of issues. But keep in mind that this particular section of the test is 10% of the test. And so it's not as huge a focus as some of the other sections, and your success rate of passing this test, isn't necessarily likely going to revolve on this particular section. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your training program, that there are some things here you need to train on, but you need to be careful. So the appurtenances is really the next section that we're looking at, and this is a lengthier section, but once again, it comes back to really the on-the-job training and some of the manufacturer specifications that are out there. You know, we're talking about assembling antennas, antenna mounts, tower lightings, connectors and fiber, hoisting grips. These are all things that are really taught through manufacturer specifications and really on-the-job training, client specifications. So we cannot be testing things based on client specifications, and our clients are basically all different. So any types of questions that are related to how many of this or how many of that, or where does this go or where does that go, those are really all questions that will come from manufacturers or construction specifications that are documented things that can either be handed out during a test or is something readily available. So when you look at hoisting grips or connectors or things like that, you know, we're going to be referring back to manufacturer specifications. So keep that in mind. Once again, this section here is really, there's not a large opportunity to look at any kind of standards from that point of view. When you look at this next section further on here, we're talking about antenna types, weatherproofing, you know, grounding again, AC/DC electricity, tower mounted equipment, color coding. But we're looking at all this once again at a very low level. You know, we're not really digging into this stuff very far. If you look at some of the things on here, there are a few standards that can apply to some of this stuff. You know, weatherproofing has manufacturer recommendations. AC/DC electricity, you know, this is an electrical situation, so you're back to the OSHA standards and your OSHA 10-hour classes. And, you know, tower mounted equipment, color coding, things of that nature, that's really on the job training. You know, do your employees recognize what color coding represents on a tower? You know, are they capable of understanding what an azimuth is, a down tilt, a side tilt? Do they understand what plumbness of an antenna means? Things of that nature, you know, the parts and pieces to some degree of antennas, or mounts for that matter. So let's keep that in mind, that this is really, you know, back to the on-the-job aspects of your training here. So the next section is our equipment, special operations. You know, I look at that as a section where we threw stuff that didn't fit in the other sections. So some of these things like aerial work platforms, the lockout, tagout, batteries, forklifts, tower demolition, welding, these are all things that your employees are exposed to out there, but they didn't really fit into one of these other sections very well. So when we're looking at aerial work platforms, you're looking at manufacturer specifications for some of this stuff. The A1048 has some information related to aerial work platforms. Your lockout, tagout situation, you're dealing with OSHA there. Batteries, we're dealing with OSHA or the DOT. Forklift training, you know, OSHA has a requirement for forklifts and to, you know, be trained as an operator. So you're working with the manufacturers on how to operate this equipment correctly. Welding and cutting, we're talking once again about OSHA and OSHA 10-hour type procedures there. So you can see that, you know, and that there are some other stuff here, you know, exothermic welding, decommissioning of stuff, the use of RF monitors. I mean, one thing for people to think about, and we come back to the language here, is do people know what exothermic welding is? Do they know the term appurtenance? As I was talking before about climbing facilities, we as an industry have adopted certain language going forward that we need to make our tower guys familiar with. So exothermic is one of those. Appurtenance is one of those. We need to make sure that we're understanding what guys are talking about when they're talking about these topics. So the exothermic welding process, that comes back to OSHA. In your 10-hour class, the appurtenance decommissioning, that's a rigging type situation, so we're following that under the 1048 or the B30 standard. Jumper support is really a manufacturer specification. RF monitoring, that's going to be part of your RF training program. Things that you have put together as a company, or if you are using a third-party training company for your RF stuff. So that's the basic kind of dive down into the domains as they stand. So we'll move on to the next section. So as a reminder, just to mention, you can find all this stuff, as I said, in the candidate handbook. The dive down stuff, the location is there. So in the candidate handbook, there's a list of references. So on the next slide, we have a list of references that are in there. So I've highlighted on here the references that I feel a majority of the test pertains to. And as we said, we're talking about the 1048 standard, the 2 OSHA standards, the Z359, and really the NATE's RF awareness book. Now I did mention the 222 standard, but that's not as not as important as some of these other ones that are there. So I wanted to show you on the website, on the next slide here, NWSA does have the reference list on the website. You can see the arrow here shows where you can find the reference. So if you clicked on the handbooks and forms tab, it brings you to this screen. If you click on the reference list, then that takes you to the next screen. In the next screen, you can see is a list of the standards, and it shows you where you can get these standards. It does tell you if some of them are have a cost associated with them. In particular, the Motorola R56 standard, there's actually a link here. You can download that standard, so it doesn't cost you anything. When you really look at these standards and the cost, you can get most of what you need for a few $100s. The OSHA standards you can find online. You don't necessarily have to pay for them. You can just search them. The 1048 standard is pretty reasonable. The only one that's a little bit pricey is the B30 standard that can be a little bit excuse me. So the standards are available out there, and I recommend getting at least some of these. Your tower guys are not likely going to be reading these standards, but your safety people, your company owners, your project managers should be familiar with these so that you can put training programs together that work for your particular company. And as I said, for our company, we basically just took our existing training programs and tailored them and stripped out of them, the information that pertains to these particular topics. So I tried today to, give you some information on how I've done it. We've stripped down our OSHA 10-hour class. We've stripped down our fall protection class. We've done some Crosby rigging training class. We've done some B30 stuff. We've done 3 or 4 hours of review of the 1048 standard with our guys. So for us, we spent several days working on training our guys, and we took this approach as not just training them to help them to be able to pass the test, but to train them to be better people in the field. And that's ultimately what we're after. The credential is nice, but the credential doesn't do the work out there. The guys do the work. So we need to focus on giving them the knowledge to pass these tests, but we really want them to understand it so that they can perform the work out there decently. So with that, I will turn it back over to Matt, I believe here, and we'll talk about some possible questions.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so we're going to take a couple of questions. I see several that have been submitted so far. If anyone in the audience has any additional questions, go ahead and send them in now. So let's go through them. So the first question is any part of the test open book?
So the written exam is not an open book test, so it is a knowledge-based and a memorization type situation, so you will not be able to take anything into the test with you. So it is important that your guys understand they need to put the time in to pass these tests. And I look at it as an attitude type situation. We can train all day long through our companies, but the field crews really need to want to learn the stuff. There's just not a way for us to inject it into their brain directly.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let's see. Next one is, I think we sort of covered this, but does any part of the test cover rigging?
There are some questions on the exam related to the rigging, but they're pretty basic on the TTT1. The TTT2 exam delves much more into rigging situations and equipment, but the one is pretty basic at this point.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. So maybe this one's a good segue. Can you elaborate on the differences between the T1 and T2?
So there's a couple significant differences. If you look at the domains, you'll see that the domains are basically the same for each of the exams. However, the level of importance changes between the two different exams. The TTT1 exam focuses fairly heavily on fall protection in the climbing section. On the TTT2 exam, those percentages go down on the climbing section, but they go up dramatically in the rigging section and hoisting, along with spreading a little bit out over some of the other sections. The other thing to keep in mind is that in the basic situation of a TTT1, we're asking a lot of questions about what is something, or can you identify something. On the TTT2 exam, you likely have the same question. However, instead of saying identify or what is this, it's going to be how do you use it or how do you inspect it. An example with one of the example questions that's given in the handbook, the TTT2 question is something like, who's qualified to inspect a gin pole? Well, on a TTT1 exam, they're not going to know how to inspect a gin pole, but the question could be, what is a gin pole? Something of that nature. So you're getting a lot of the same questions to some degree on the TTT2 exam but at a higher level.
Okay, thank you. We're getting a couple more questions in here. Let's see. Just go through the list here. So, is there a study guide available?
At this point, the only study guide out there is the handbook. And actually, this webinar, to some degree, is an attempt to provide a study guide for you. I've given you a little bit of insight into what I think you really need to look at from the information in the standards, but there is no true study guide at this point.
Okay. So I've got a couple of questions here. I'm going to, I guess, summarize them. They're all kind of the same topic. So the questions relate to whether there is currently a test available in Spanish, and I guess if not, is one going to be available?
Right now, there's not currently a test available in Spanish. I know the board of directors and the board of governors have talked about this topic. I don't believe it's currently in the works to have a multilingual version. Part of it has to do somewhat with the translation of some of it, and just the effort of translating the test into some of the different dialects. If you want to say Spanish, for example, there's a lot of different dialects for Spanish. So even if we translate it into, I guess I'll call it technically Spanish, there still could be a lot of Spanish speaking people that still could not understand the exam because of the, or where they originate from.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay, so another question, if you fail the first exam, can you retake it?
Yes, if you fail the exam, you can continue to retake it. There is no limit to what you can, how many times you can take it. Your limit and how many times you can take it is probably going to be your checkbook. Most people, are not taking this exam multiple times. They're passing it at a fairly, high rate at this point as far as the Triple T1 goes. But yes, you can take it multiple times, and I'd have to double check, but I'm not sure on how quickly you can retake the exam. The bigger issue probably, or the limiting factor, is how fast can you reschedule the exam. And I would guess the shortest period of time that you can probably take the exam is probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of a week, because you have to re-register with NWSA. That can take a day or two, and then ultimately you have to get the PSI facility to schedule you in, and depending on what they're doing, they could be a few days out or even a few weeks out to get you back in there. So my recommendation is put the effort in to begin with and don't fail.
Okay, let's see. We got a couple more questions coming in here, so let me just go through these. So is there some way to, if I understand the question correctly, is there some way to customize or differentiate the type of test based on the specific work that the company does? So, for example, if they do not do exothermic welding or work with gin poles, can the tests be customized to that?
Well, the short answer to that is no, the test is not customized. But to explain a little bit of the thought process, this particular written exam is fairly heavy in line and antenna type situations. Me, for example, my company, we do very limited line and antenna work. So from the standpoint of my guys being able to pass this exam, it did require a little bit of effort on our part and some training. And the issue really when you look at these tests is everybody can say a particular test, no matter what the test is, doesn't apply to me, or there's stuff on here I don't know about. In some cases, the goal of these exams are to educate you on some things that you don't know about. But ultimately, the issue is we can't have 27 different exams for every particular criteria that's out there. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we go to some higher levels out there, that there will be some more specialty type areas out there that you will be able to go more in your area. So, for example, the foreman task force is developing an antenna line foreman or an antenna line specialty for the foreman and the Triple T2. So there will be likely other specialties such as broadcast or DAS or rigging or tower erection, tower modifications, those kinds of things. So companies that have specific focuses will be able to achieve those specialties in their particular field. So for example, if you're not doing line and antenna work, there would be no need for you to get an antenna online specialty. But if you're doing broadcast work, you could get the broadcast specialty. But we feel that a lot of this information, when you look at rigging, for example, or if you look at fall protection, those two particular topics don't really matter what you're doing on a tower. The rigging concepts or the fall protection concepts apply to all fields of telecommunication or broadcast. So your climbing harness is the same whether you do tower modifications or whether or not you do line and antenna work. So keep in mind, a lot of this stuff may be the examples given may be a line and antenna type example, or maybe a tower modification example or something like that. But it's not so much the example that is important, it's the concept of how do you rig something that is important, let's say, not so much what you're actually lifting, if it's a cellular antenna versus a broadcast antenna versus a microwave antenna. We're still trying to lift a piece of equipment, and it's important that we know how to lift it. So we want to really look at these exams as what is the overall concept, and ultimately, no matter what the exam is, there's kind of the 80-20 rule that 80% of this exam is going to apply to a lot of people, and there's going to be 20% on this test that you're going to have no idea on. And so you can approach those and either that you're going to guess when you're on the exam, or you can make a little bit of effort to learn something. So the exams won't be really catered, at least on the Triple T1 or Triple T2. They could evolve over time. There may be other Triple T1 or Triple T2 classifications down the line, but in the short term, there's only the one we got.
Okay, let's see. I think we got time for a couple more questions. Let me just go through. So does the NWSA card have the employee's company name on it, or the company who sponsored the employee?
The NWSA credential is an employee-based credential. It is owned, if you want to call it, by the employee. So there is no information on the card related to the company, and it is an employee credential. It is not the company's credential. So when you move from company to company, the credential moves with you. The company has no control over that credential. And so if you were to lose your credential, I'm assuming for a fee, NWSA can provide you with a new card. You are in the system under that credential. So if you know your number or somebody else knows your number, they can determine if you are in fact credentialed. But it is not something that's controlled by the company. Even if your company is the one that's registering you and paying for it and things of that nature, it is still a credential that is for you personally. It's basically similar to your driver's license. It goes where you go.
Okay, thank you. So there's a couple other questions here related to the practical exam. I guess briefly, maybe we can tackle maybe one of those. Just what are the types of skills that are evaluated on the practical side?
So the short and quick answer is take a look at the handbook. Online, download the handbook. The handbook tells you what each of the practical exams are. It lays out the steps and the various tasks that you have to complete. And it's pretty in-depth for the most part. It's basically, it doesn't give you the answers, but it tells you what you're going to be doing. Generically on the practical exam for the Triple T1, you're assembling an antenna, you're putting on your climbing gear, you're ascending a tower and mounting an antenna on it, you're routing a jumper, you are performing a weatherproofing action, and you are tying some knots. On the TTT2 exam, it's currently some rigging scenarios, a guy wire swap, some inspection scenarios. But basically those things are in the handbook and spelled right out. Now, as a practical examiner, I've had several people show up for practical exams that didn't know a handbook existed and didn't have any idea what they're even going to be tested on. So that's where I recommend that you definitely look at the handbook so you have some thoughts about what you're up against. And the same thing goes for the written exam. You know, the handbook and the domains we just went through and the information I've given you, you know, really tells you the topics. You know, it's a little bit tough on the written exam because you say, you know, here's a book that's 300 pages long and we're going to ask 3 questions out of it. You know, do you read the whole book? But the handbook has a lot of information for you there.
Okay, great. So there's several questions here regarding whether or not the webinar, the presentation here is going to be available for, I guess, for download. I'm going to follow up on that, whether we're going to make the actual PowerPoint available, and then those of you who asked that question will follow up with you separately. I do know that the recording of this webinar will be available online shortly after, I think within a couple of days or so, after we conclude the webinar today. So that at least that will be available. I think we're going to wrap up the questions session for, right now. I do know that there's a couple other questions that we will follow up with. Those of you who asked, if we didn't get to your question, I know that we'll follow up with you afterwards on that. I'd like to thank everyone for submitting their questions, and we'll get back to you on that. So that's going to bring us to the end of the webinar. Please stay tuned for information on upcoming webinars, which we will be announcing in the next few weeks. We're going to be making a recording of this webinar available for those who are unable to attend, or those who just want to review it again. And then we'll have more information about that up on the website, in the webinars section of the website shortly. And then, so just real quick, I'm going to put the NWSA information email up on the website, or up on the screen there. So if you have any other additional questions that you think of after the webinar concludes, go ahead and send them in there, and someone will follow up with you and try to answer any questions and help clear anything up. So I appreciate everyone's time today, and we're going to wrap up, and I hope everyone has a good day. So thank you all, and especially thanks for taking the time to do this.
Have a good day, everyone.